Welcome to Ryan's Running Reviews in partnership with Roadrunner Sports, and today we're taking a look at three of On's popular daily trainers. We have the Cloudsurfer, the Cloudstratus, and the Cloudmonster. What's wrong with that? Now, before we get started, I do want to say these shoes were provided to me by Roadrunner Sports. However, no one had a chance to preview this video, and this file synopsis is my own. I'd also like to say please leave a like on the video and consider subscribing. Here we go. Now, the reason we're taking a look at these three in particular is On running shoes typically run to the firmer side of things, and for someone who likes On running but wants a bit more cushion, I think these three are your best bet. For example, the Cloudmonster is their thickest shoe with their largest CloudTech units ever. The Cloudstratus is kind of like their tier 2 max cushion shoe with 2 layers of CloudTech units. And then we have the Cloudsurfer, and while it doesn't have the largest midsole, I will say I think this is the softest On Cloud running shoe as it does not have a speedboard inside the midsole. Hope that makes sense. Each of these shoes do come in at a different price point. The Cloudsurfer is $160, the Cloudstratus is $180, and the Cloudmonster is $170. As far as weight goes, the Cloudsurfer is the lightest, coming in at a very respectable 8.6 ounces. The Cloudstratus is the heaviest at 10.2 ounces. And the Cloudmonster, which is surprisingly light for how large it is, only weighs 9.7 ounces. I reached out to On directly to get the stack height information for each of these shoes, so this comes directly from the source. And according to On, the Cloudsurfer has 32 in the heel with a 10mm drop. The Cloudstratus has 30 in the heel with a 6mm drop, and the Cloudmonster is the thickest option with 34mm and another 6mm heel to toe drop, just like the Cloudstratus. So for this review, I'm going to get straight to the point, tell you what I think of each of these shoes, and then later on I'll get into the nitty-gritty, describe the upper, the differences between the midsoles, and all of that. But for right now, let me just tell you what I think. In my opinion, the Cloudsurfer is the softer and more comfortable shoe, as there is no plastic speedboard inside the midsole, and you don't feel that bit of plastic directly under your foot. And even without that plastic plate, the rocker geometry is very noticeable. It has a very aggressive shape to the midsole, and with the CloudTech phase new technology, it just felt like a softer, kind of more energetic ride, at least compared to these other two shoes. It's also over an ounce lighter and just felt softer, lighter, and more agile, in my opinion, making this, I think, just the more fun and comfortable overall daily trainer. Moving on to the Cloudstratus and the Cloudmonster, there's some subtle differences, but the biggest thing is the CloudTech units. Here on the Cloudmonster, you can see directly through the entire midsole, which means these larger CloudTech units have further to collapse and just have a bit more squish to them, while here on the Cloudstratus, it feels a bit more dense. You kind of have this staggered, stacked CloudTech unit approach, and you can't see all the way through the midsole, which means the CloudTech units don't have as far to collapse, but they do provide a much more dense level of cushioning compared to the Cloudmonster. The Cloudmonster is also slightly lighter, and I will say it's just a tad bit more versatile, and if I had to pick between these two, I'm probably going with the Cloudmonster, but it's not a massive difference. I will say the Cloudstratus is the more stable of the two options, and I do prefer the tongue and lockdown on this shoe compared to the Cloudmonster. So those are my high-level thoughts. Let's get into some of the finer details, starting with the uppers. Each of these shoes has 2 layers to the upper. You have the outer engineered mesh, which you can see, and on the inside there's an internal layer of fabric which connects to the tongue, meaning each of these tongues is fully gusseted. The big difference, however, is the tongue on the Cloudmonster is paper thin. It doesn't give you a ton of lace pressure protection. On the Cloudstratus, you have a large foam block that goes down the center, and the tongue has a minimal amount of padding. I think it worked quite well. And then here on the Cloudsurfer, it's a much more traditional tongue, kind of what you're used to from a more classic running shoe, if you will. Each of these fit true to size, but I will say I think the Cloudmonster and the Cloudstratus had plenty of room in the toe box with a very accommodating fit. The Cloudsurfer had a slightly more narrow experience, not overly restrictive, but more narrow compared to the other two options here. I thought the Cloudstratus had the best lockdown for a couple reasons. One, you have this midfoot cage or an additional layer of fabric across the midfoot to give you some added security. It has a more strict plastic heel clip towards the base, which I think gives the heel counter just some additional structure. And while the heel counter is pretty flexible towards the top, it made my heel feel quite secure. Plus, you have a moderate level of padding for additional comfort. If we compare that to the Cloudmonster, there is no plastic heel clip towards the base, but it is rather tall, has a moderate level of cushioning, and I thought did a solid job of giving me a secure fit, just not as good as the Cloudstratus. And then if we go over to the Cloudsurfer, it got the job done. I just didn't feel like the heel counter was as secure compared to the other two options here. It was fine, has a little bit more of a narrow fit through the toe box and midfoot, but again, I wish the heel counter just had a little bit more structure to it, or maybe it was just a tad bit taller. Moving on to the midsoles, we have Helion foam in each of them. Now, Helion, at least according to On, is their super foam, but we see something different on their Cloudboom Echo, which is their top tier super shoe, which is a Pebax-based material. I would be very curious to see how Pebax holds up in this configuration, just because of how the structure is and how unique the midsoles are with how they support the weight of the runner, but we shall see. But for now, we have Helion foam, which is a more dense, more firm kind of foam, which is supposed to be temperature resistant, at least according to On. And if you're not familiar with On running shoes, each of these little holes is called a CloudTech unit, and the holes here, or CloudTech units, are the largest on any of On's running shoes, giving you a really unique sensation with the Cloudmonster and the most compression in the midsole out of all of On's running shoes. Now, if we compare that to the Cloudstratus, which has the same kind of midsole foam, it has a different configuration of those On CloudTech units. They're staggered and stacked, so you can kind of see what that pattern looks like, giving you a more dense, more closed off sensation with less compression, giving you a more dense level of cushioning. Both the Monster and the Stratus have something called a speed board, which you can see here on the Monster is this little cutout. The Stratus does not have that cutout, which I think is smart because I keep on getting things stuck inside the midsole here. So hopefully they kind of fill that in or do a different kind of configuration. But nonetheless, this little piece here is the plastic speed board. It's a plastic plate that extends directly underneath your foot, sits on top of the CloudTech units, and allows for better energy dispersion. Kind of helps you notice that rocker geometry, stiffens up the shoe, and it's basically a plate. You've probably heard a lot about plates now, and that's basically what this is. The one thing I'll say is it sits right below your foot. It doesn't really swoop down because you have those CloudTech units in the way, which means you feel the plastic plate right beneath your foot, which can become a little bit of an issue, at least it was for me on those longer runs or if you wear this shoe all day long. The Cloudsurfer has no speed board, making it rather unique. I think it's the only On shoe to not have a speed board, which means there's no firm plastic underneath your foot. And to compensate for this, they had something called CloudTech Phase, which is a different shaped kind of hole through the center of the midsole, which is what On is known for. So it kind of collapses forward, gives you a rather soft sensation because you can actually feel the foam beneath your foot. It feels very much like a non-plated, more traditional daily trainer with a slightly unique sensation of the midsole having this kind of another level of movement to it, if that makes sense. Very noticeable rocker geometry, rather light, at least compared to these two, and I think feels like a softer, just more fun option. And I do quite like this. Just feels like a little bit more of a quick daily trainer compared to these other two plated options with their rather firm midsoles, which I think do a good job of kind of giving you just a consistent cruiser of a daily trainer. Moving on to the outsole, the Cloudsurfer has a really smooth traction pattern with strategic rubber in the forefoot, no rubber in the midfoot, and a little bit of rubber in the heel. It works fine with those more conventional surfaces, but if you're planning on taking this thing off-road, I wouldn't do it just because it's a very like race car-like traction pattern. If we go on to the Cloudstratus, I think this has the best traction, and if we compare it to the Cloudmonster, it's a little bit more traditional to the On running shoe lineup. You have more ground contact on the Stratus just because those CloudTech units are closer together and smaller, giving you, I guess, those less bubble-like texture, if you will, on the outsole. So overall, Cloudmonster was fine, but I think the Cloudstratus does kind of take the first prize when it comes to outsole traction, probably overall durability. Overall, the Cloudsurfer is the softer, faster, and lighter running shoe, as there is no plastic plate directly underneath your foot, which is nice if you're going to wear the shoe for a long period of time. My only major real complaints here is I wish there was some better traction, and I wish the heel counter was similar to what we see on the Stratus and the Monster. I just feel like those had a better level of security compared to the Cloudsurfer, which is great if you want to slip this shoe on and off, but not so great if you want to feel truly connected to the platform. Then if we go on to the Cloudmonster, I'd probably rank this as number 2 if we're going to rank these things. Has a really unique level of cushioning with the midsole. It doesn't weigh a whole lot for how large the shoe is. And while I wish the tongue maybe had a bit more padding and maybe felt a bit softer in the midsole, it provides a very unique ride. I think this is quite polarizing. This is like some people's favorite shoe and their least favorite shoe. And for me, it's kind of somewhere in the middle. I do like it. It's not my favorite shoe ever, but I think it provides kind of a cool looking and unique experience overall. And then at number 3, the Cloudstratus, getting all these names mixed up, kind of like a workhorse, okay, stable daily trainer with a plastic heel clip, solid lockdown through the upper, just provides a more dense midsole feeling, at least in my experience, just because those CloudTech units don't have as far to collapse. And then another kind of random side note, I didn't feel the speedboard underneath my foot as drastically as I did with the Cloudmonster. I'm not sure why that is. I know they both have speedboards, but when wearing the Cloudmonster for a long period of time, you start to kind of feel that plastic plate pretty aggressively directly under your foot. And that was not the case here with the Cloudstratus. I wore this thing all day, would run in it, and then just wear it for the rest of the day. And I didn't feel like that the speedboard became super noticeable. But this feels kind of like a more traditional, dense trainer. And most on Cloud shoes run to the firmer side of things, which I think is definitely the case here with the Cloudstratus, and even to a degree with the Cloudmonster, again, just because you have that plastic plate directly under your foot. So let me know down in the comments, what do you think of all running shoes, and what do you think of this new direction that they're going in? I would love to hear from you. Well, I'm Ryan from Ryan's Running Reviews, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Thanks.